Boone Whitlock was not a man who frightened easily. He had spent 3 years riding ahead of the army through country that could kill you in a dozen quiet ways, and he had come out the other side with most of his fingers, most of his hearing, and none of his easy sleep. He was 53 years old, broad through the shoulders, slow to speak, and slower to trust. His ranch sat in the dry country east of Globe, where the foothills began to break toward the San Carlos reservation boundary. On still mornings, he could hear the distant sound of dogs barking from Apache camps beyond the ridge. That July morning in 1889 began the same way every morning began. Heat before sunrise. Dust that tasted like old iron. He checked the water trough first, then walked the fence line south, then followed the prints his horses had left overnight to make sure nothing had spooked them in the dark. It was routine, and Boone trusted routine the way other men trusted God. But somewhere along the south fence, the morning changed. He almost walked past it. A mesquite thicket, heavy with ripe pods, growing right up against the boundary line where his leased land met the edge of the reservation. The pods hung full and yellow, more than enough to fill both hands a dozen times over. Mesquite was stubborn and generous in equal measure, and the late spring rains had been just kind enough to push the fruit early. What stopped him was the ground beneath the bush. Someone had been there, recently. The soil was soft enough near the wash to hold impressions, and he could see them clearly in the low morning light. Small boots, a woman's stride, moving fast, not wandering. Beside the base of the thicket there was a torn piece of cloth, the kind you might use to carry something. A few mesquite pods had been pulled from the lower branches and then dropped, as if the person holding them had left in a hurry, or had been made to leave. In running from the base of the thicket back toward the road into Globe, there was a thin, dark line in the dust that Boone crouched down and studied for a long moment before he recognized it. Blood. Not much, but enough. He stood up slowly. He looked at the pod still hanging on the branches. He looked at the tracks leading away. The Apache had eaten mesquite pods for generations, ground them into flour, boiled them into a thick paste that could carry a man or a child through lean weeks. It was survival food, the kind you reached for when everything else was gone. And this thicket was sitting right there, full and unharvested, in the middle of summer, while someone with small boots and a torn carrying cloth had tried to reach it and then run away bleeding. Boone was not a man who jumped to conclusions, but he had spent enough time in contested country to know when a trap had been built around something that should have been free. He pulled his hat down against the morning glare, turned back to the corral for his horse, and rode toward Globe. He did not know what he was riding into, but here's the question that stayed with him the whole way there, and it may stay with you too. Who benefits when a starving person is punished for reaching toward food that no one else wanted? Boone had followed blood trails before, but this one felt different. It did not lead away from danger. It led straight into the kind of town that smiled while hiding its teeth. Globe was not a big town, but it knew how to put on a show. By the time Boone Whitlock rode down the main street, a crowd had already gathered in the dust near the sheriff's office. Not the kind of crowd that forms around a fist fight, loud and hungry for blood. This was quieter than that. The kind of crowd that watches something uncomfortable and cannot quite decide whether to speak up or look away. Boone had seen that particular silence before. It never meant anything good. He slowed his horse and looked past the shoulders of the men standing along the edge of the street. And there she was. For a moment, Boone forgot the crowd, the sheriff, even the heat. All he saw was the rope on her wrists and the handful of desert food lying in the dirt, like proof that the world had gone mean in a very ordinary way. A young Apache woman, maybe mid-20s, kneeling in the dirt with her wrists bound in front of her. Her dress was torn at the shoulder. There were cuts on her knees from where she had been dragged or pushed down, still fresh enough to darken the fabric. Her black hair fell forward across her face, but she did not bow her head. She kept her eyes level, fixed on some point in the middle distance, like a person who has decided that whatever is happening to them, it will not have the satisfaction of breaking their expression. Boone recognized something in that posture. Dignity held together with nothing but will. Standing a few feet away, Sheriff Asa Varn was addressing the crowd like a man who enjoyed the sound of his own voice considerably more than the situation required. Asa was the kind of lawman who had learned early that a badge and a loud manner could carry a man a long way in a territorial town. He was announcing that the woman had been apprehended for trespass and theft, that she had left the reservation without a pass, that she had stolen food from land belonging to white settlers. Boone dismounted, tied his horse, and pushed through to the front of the crowd without excusing himself. He looked at what they were calling the stolen goods. It was a small pile in the dirt, a handful of mesquite pods, dried and cracked, the kind that fall off the lower branches on their own if you so much as brush against the bush. There was no flour, no livestock, no money. Nothing that any reasonable man would look at and call theft. It was food that the desert itself had dropped on the ground, and this young woman had apparently been caught with it in her hands. Boone looked at the pile. Then he looked at Asa. "That what she took?" he said. It was not really a question. Asa straightened up. "She left the reservation without authorization. The law is the law, Mr. Whitlock." And that was true, technically. Under the agency pass system, any Apache who left reservation land without written permission from the Indian agent could be arrested on the spot. The law did not ask why they left. It did not ask if they were hungry. It only asked whether they had the right piece of paper. And if they did not, the answer was a rope around the wrists and a walk to the jail. Boone stood in the sun and looked at this young woman in the dirt, and thought about the torn cloth under the mesquite bush that morning, and the thin line of blood in the dust, and something settled in his chest like a stone dropping to the bottom of a well. He had been a scout. He had ridden ahead of the army into Apache country and told himself at the time that he was just doing a job. Standing here now, in the middle of Globe's main street, with a young woman bleeding in the dirt over a handful of wild pods, that old story felt considerably less convincing than it used to. He turned to Asa. "What does it cost to settle this?" Asa smiled, and it was not a pleasant smile. He named a figure that had no relationship to any actual law or fine Boone had ever heard of. It was the kind of number a man invents on the spot when he understands that the person across from him will pay it, and the person on the ground cannot. Boone did not argue the figure. He reached into his coat and counted out the bills right there in the street, slow enough that every man watching could see exactly what was happening and why. He was not paying a fine. He was buying a woman's freedom from a performance being held in her name, and he wanted the audience to understand the difference. What he did not know yet, what none of them standing in that street could have guessed, was that the girl kneeling in the dirt knew something. Something about where the food in the reservation had actually been going, and why the shelves were empty, and whose name was written in a ledger that certain men in Globe would burn the world down to keep buried. If this kind of story speaks to you, where one ordinary man sees one wrong thing and follows it to the bottom, stay with this one. And if you want more Old West stories like it, subscribe now, because what Boone found next went far deeper than one girl and one corrupt sheriff. Asa pocketed the money without counting it, which told Boone everything he needed to know about how often this particular transaction took place. He handed Boone the rope attached to Mara's wrists with the casual ease of a man returning a borrowed tool, and announced that the woman was released into Whitlock's custody until sundown. Then he turned and walked back into his office, and the crowd drifted apart, the way crowds do when the entertainment is over, and the heat reminds them they have other places to be. Boone stood in the street holding the end of that rope and felt about as comfortable as a man can feel holding a rope attached to another human being, which is to say, not comfortable at all. He walked Mara around the corner, out of the main street, into the narrow shade beside the feed store, where the two of them were alone for the first time. He stopped. He reached into his boot, pulled out his folding knife, and cut the rope from her wrists without saying a word about it. He did not make a speech. He did not explain himself. He just cut it and put the knife away. Mara looked at her wrists, then looked at him. The suspicion in her eyes did not disappear. She had lived long enough on the boundary between two worlds to know that kindness with no visible price tag was often the most expensive kind. "Your brother," Boone said quietly. "How bad?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said the fever had been 4 days, that she had boiled water with what little she had left, but he needed food with weight to it. Mesquite flour would have helped, even a little. The boy was with Mara's aunt in a brush shelter just inside the reservation line, she said. Close enough for Boone to reach by nightfall, if he had the nerve, and far enough inside the line that the wrong kind of white man would call the trip another violation. Boone nodded and said nothing more about it. He brought her back to the ranch on horseback, let her ride while he walked the horse by the bridle, which was not something many men around Globe would have done. It just seemed like the obvious arrangement, given that she was the one with cuts on her knees, and he was the one with working boots. At the ranch, he cleaned her shoulder wound and set out water, dried meat, and a portion of cornmeal without asking whether she wanted it, because asking a hungry person whether they want food is one of those polite habits that borders on insulting. She ate steadily and without embarrassment, which he respected. They did not talk much through the afternoon. Boone had always been more comfortable with silence than conversation, and Mara seemed to be cut from the same cloth. It was after dark, when the air finally dropped below burning, that Mara spoke at length for the first time. She sat on the edge of the porch with her hands around a tin cup and told him that her brother was not the only one going hungry. That across the San Carlos reservation, families had been running short for weeks. That the flour rations arrived already spoiled, or arrived half the listed weight, or sometimes did not arrive in the quantities the agent recorded at all. That people were getting sick, not from disease, but from slow, quiet, ordinary starvation dressed up in paperwork. Boone sat on the step below her and listened without interrupting. He had a habit of listening the way a good tracker reads ground, not looking for what he expected to find, but for what was actually there. What was actually there was this. The shortages were not random. They followed a pattern, and the pattern pointed toward a name. Eldon Pike. Boone knew the name, not well enough to call him an enemy, but well enough to know that men like Pike never got rich by carrying sacks themselves. They got rich by making hungry people invisible. Pike ran the supply contracts for the reservation out of Globe, which was a position that sounded boring and administrative, until you understood that it meant he controlled what went in and what was recorded as going in, and that in territorial Arizona in 1889, the distance between those two things could be wide enough to bury a wagon in. And then Mara said something that made everything else rearrange itself in his mind. She said that the first time she had tried to reach the mesquite thicket 2 nights before she was caught, she had turned back not because of the boundary line, but because she had seen wagon tracks near the wash that had no business being there at that hour. Boone looked at her. "Show me," he said. Mara knew the ground better than Boone expected, which he supposed he should not have been surprised by, given that her people had walked this land for generations before anyone thought to draw a line through it on a piece of paper. She moved low and quiet through the brush, favoring her good shoulder, and Boone followed her lead without question. He had learned a long time ago that the smartest thing a man can do in unfamiliar country is to stop pretending he knows it better than someone who grew up there. The wash was maybe a quarter-mile south of the mesquite thicket, a dry channel carved by water that only appeared a few times a year. In summer it was nothing but cracked clay and pale stone. Easy to overlook, easy to use. Mara stopped at the edge and pointed down into the bed of the wash without speaking. Boone climbed down and crouched in the clay. The wagon tracks were still there, pressed deep enough that even a week of wind had not smoothed them out completely. Heavy load going in, lighter coming out. He followed the tracks along the wash wall until they ended at a section where the bank had been disturbed. Soil scraped back and pushed forward again, rough and hurried, the kind of job a man does when he wants something hidden but does not have time to do it neatly. Boone pulled his knife and worked the edge into the packed soil. It did not take long. The ground gave way too easily, and that bothered him. Whatever was buried there had not been hidden for years. It had been hidden recently by men who expected to come back for it. The first thing he found was the corner of a burlap sack stenciled with the words, United States Indian Department. Then another. Then a wooden crate still holding several tins of salt. He kept digging, and the picture kept getting clearer and uglier, the way those things usually do the deeper you go. There were at least a dozen sacks buried in that wash. Flour, cornmeal, dried beans, salt. Reservation rations, government issue, the kind of supplies that, on paper, had already been delivered and signed for and counted as received. Except they were here, under the dirt, outside the reservation boundary, within easy reach of the road to Globe. And then Mara reached into the gap beneath the lowest crate and pulled out a folded delivery sheet, stiff with dust and stained along one edge. She handed it to Boone without a word. He opened it in the pale early light and read slowly. It was not the full ledger, but it was enough. Eldon Pike's name was written at the bottom, along with a delivery count that did not match the sacks buried under the wash bank. On paper, the supplies had been delivered to San Carlos. In the dirt, they were lying right here, hidden outside the reservation boundary. The missing supplies had not vanished. They had been redirected, sold to ranchers and miners around Globe at prices well below market rate. Because when your goods cost you nothing, and a sheriff keeps the hungry too afraid to complain, the profit is handsome. Boone folded the delivery sheet and put it inside his coat. He looked at Mara. She was watching him with the expression of someone who already knew the answer and had been waiting a long time for someone else to catch up. They were climbing back out of the wash when he heard the horses. Later, Boone would understand why they had come so fast. Asa had left a boy watching the road outside his ranch, and the boy had ridden hard for Globe the moment Boone and Mara left before dawn. Not one, several. Coming from the direction of Globe at a pace that was not casual. Boone got low against the bank and pulled Mara down beside him, and they waited while the riders came into view above the wash line. 4 men, Asa Varn in front, Badge catching the first real light of morning. Beside him, a heavier man in a tan coat whom Boone recognized as Eldon Pike himself. The other 2 were hired guns, the kind of men whose faces you forget immediately because there is nothing behind them worth remembering. Asa did not call out a warning or announce any intention to make an arrest. That told Boone everything. A man who intends to arrest you says so, because the law requires it, and because witnesses matter. A man who says nothing when he finds you is not planning on there being any witnesses. What happened next was not elegant, and Boone would not have described it as a victory in any conventional sense. He was 53 years old, heavier than he used to be, and his best years of running and jumping were considerably behind him. But he had 20 years of reading ground in exactly this kind of terrain, and he knew without thinking where to move and where to make the other man move instead. He pulled Ace's lead horse sideways with a length of rope looped around a root, which sent the animal skidding and Asa cursing into the bank. One hired gun came down into the wash and found that dry clay is an extremely poor environment for a man whose primary skill is standing upright and looking threatening. Boone put him against the wall with an efficiency that his younger self would have appreciated. The second man pulled back to the high ground, which is precisely where Boone wanted him. Boone had a second pistol tucked beneath the saddle blanket, a habit from his scouting days he had never abandoned, and he used it to persuade that individual to reconsider his career choices. Mara, meanwhile, was not standing still. She had moved to Pike's wagon, brought along presumably to haul away the buried evidence. She cut the lashings on the wagon bed with quick, clean strokes, and when the boards gave way, every sack and crate came sliding out into the open air. Flour, cornmeal, salt. United States Indian Department, stenciled in black on every single bag, sitting in the dirt in plain daylight on the wrong side of the reservation boundary. Then, as Pike scrambled toward the wagon seat, Mara saw what he was reaching for. Beneath the loose board under the seat sat a cloth-covered ledger book wrapped in oilskin. She snatched it first and threw it to Boone. By this point, the noise had drawn people from the road. A freighter, 2 men from a nearby ranch, a woman on horseback had had the presence of mind to stop and take in the whole scene before deciding which direction to feel about it. Asa was on the ground, disarmed, breathing hard. Pike was sitting against his wagon wheel with the expression of a man watching his entire future rearrange itself into something considerably worse than what he had planned. And every person standing on that road could see, without being told and without needing a lawyer to explain it to them, exactly what they were looking at. Before we get to what happened next, I want to take just a moment here. If you have made it this far into the story, you are exactly the kind of listener this channel exists for. Someone who appreciates a story told with patience and respect for the truth. If you are not subscribed yet, now's a good time. Hit that subscribe button, because the ending of this one is worth staying for, and there are more stories like it waiting for you right here every week. Boone marched Asa Varn and Eldon Pike back into Globe on foot, which was a deliberate choice. A man walking in the dirt with his hands bound behind him, being led through the main street of a town he has spent years controlling, cannot maintain much dignity. Boone understood the value of a clear picture, and he wanted every person in Globe to have one they would not forget quickly. The freighter who had witnessed the scene at the wash rode ahead and spread the word, so by the time Boone arrived with his 2 prisoners and the wagon loaded with recovered government rations, a crowd had already gathered. Not the uneasy look-away crowd from the day before. This one was quieter in a different way. The way people get quiet when they are recalculating something they thought they understood. Boone stopped in the center of the street, opened the ledger, and read from it out loud. He was not a courtroom man and made no pretense of being one. He simply read the columns, the official numbers and the actual numbers, side by side, month after month, in Eldon Pike's own careful handwriting. He let the arithmetic speak for itself, because arithmetic does not have an agenda and cannot be argued with on personal grounds. Asa said nothing at all, which was the smartest thing he had done in some time. A federal marshal was sent for. It would take days for him to arrive from Tucson, and Boone knew that the legal machinery that followed would be slow and imperfect and tilted in ways that rarely favored anyone who looked like Mara or came from where she came from. But the ledger was real. The witnesses were real. The sacks of government flour sitting in Pike's wagon were real. Sometimes real things, even in imperfect systems, managed to find their way through. It was while they were waiting that Asa made his last mistake. He had been left with one ranch hand watching him, which, in retrospect, was one man fewer than the situation required. Asa got his hands loose, reached for the pistol his guard had foolishly left within range, and brought it up fast. He was not aiming at Boone. He was aiming past him, at the easier target, the one who had no badge, no legal standing, and no one in Globe who was obligated to care if she was gone. He was aiming at Mara. She moved before the sound of the hammer click had fully registered in Boone's ears. Not away. Toward. She caught Asa's wrist with both hands and turned it with the kind of leverage that comes from a lifetime of physical work. The first shot went wide into the dirt. Asa twisted hard, trying to bring the pistol back toward her. Boone covered the distance in about 3 steps and stepped between them just as the second shot cracked. The bullet caught Boone across the shoulder, a graze more than a wound, but enough to bleed freely. The situation was resolved shortly after that in a manner that left Asa with a split lip and considerably fewer options than he had started the morning with. He sat down on the steps of the feed store and pressed his bandana to it. Mara crouched beside him, pulled the yellow bandana away, looked at the wound with calm, practiced eyes, and replaced it with a folded strip of cloth she tore from the hem of her dress without making any fuss about it. It was not a tender moment exactly. It was a practical one. But sometimes practical is the most honest kind of tender there is. She stayed at the ranch for 4 days after that. On the first night, Boone rode with her to a dry crossing near the reservation line, where Mara's aunt brought the boy out wrapped in a blanket and shaking with fever. Boone said nothing about passes or papers. He put the child on his horse and brought him back to the ranch. By the 4th morning, the fever had broken. Boone rode out to the reservation boundary each day after that and left food there, cornmeal and dried meat and a portion of the recovered rations. He did not make an announcement about it. He just left it and rode back. He and Mara did not talk much more than they had before, which suited them both. But something had shifted between them in the way that things shift between two people who have been in a dangerous place together and came out the other side, still standing. It does not always announce itself. It just settles in quietly, like the desert after a hard wind. Everything rearranged, but holding. One evening she washed his yellow bandana in the basin by the pump and hung it on the nail beside the door to dry. He noticed it when he came in for supper and did not say anything about it. She did not say anything about it either. But he left it hanging there after she had gone, and it stayed there. Then on the 5th morning, a rider came in from the direction of Fort Apache. He was a government man, young, officious, carrying papers with official seals on them. He handed Boone a document informing him that he was under investigation for obstruction of lawful federal authority. He handed Mara a separate document, a formal order requiring her to return to San Carlos immediately to answer for leaving the reservation without a pass. Boone read both papers twice. He was a deliberate reader. Then he looked up at the young government man and asked one question. He asked whether the same federal authority that was now very concerned about proper paperwork had been equally concerned about the paperwork recording 8 months of fraudulent ration deliveries to 500 Apache men, women, and children. The young man said that was a separate matter under separate investigation. Boone nodded slowly and said he supposed it was. He looked at Mara. She was watching him with those steady, dark eyes. Not afraid, not asking him for anything, just watching, the way she had watched him from the dirt on the main street of Globe 4 days ago, deciding for herself what kind of man he was. He looked out past the fence toward the mesquite thicket on the southern boundary, heavy with pods in the full summer heat, the same thicket where a small pile of dropped fruit and a thin line of blood in the dust had started all of this. 4 days ago it had seemed like a small thing, a handful of wild pods, a woman in a hurry, an injustice so ordinary that most men would have walked past it before their coffee went cold. He had not walked past it. But Ryder was waiting for an answer. Boone pulled his hat down against the morning sun and said, quietly and without any particular drama, that they would need a little more time, and that he intended to make some inquiries of his own before either of them went anywhere at all. The rope that Asa Varn had tied around Mara's wrists in the main street of Globe was gone. But Boone Whitlock was standing in his own yard looking at a larger rope than that one made of paper and seals and the slow machinery of a government that punished the hungry for reaching toward food and protected the men who stole it from them. He had not yet decided what he intended to do about it. But if you have listened this far, you already know one thing about Boone Whitlock. And Boone Whitlock was not the kind of man who walked away from a trail once blood had shown him where it began.